Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Space Channel. No human being has ever been born anywhere except Earth. Not one in the entire history of the species, and that single gap is the quiet problem underneath every generation ship ever designed. The only two gravity levels human bodies have ever developed under are 1 and approximately none. Everything in between is unmeasured. So a ship that spins to make its own weight is guessing at what a skeleton actually needs, guessing at what partial gravity does to a growing eye, guessing at what a nervous system calibrated by rotation quietly becomes. Tonight, one life, followed from before it begins to after it ends. If you find these explorations worth your time, a like or a subscribe helps the channel reach others who do. Thank you for being here. But for the next 2 hours, none of this is something you need to carry. It is a life that was lived quietly, a long way from here, and it asks nothing of anyone. Settle in. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow. Let the day fade away. Let's begin. There is a particular kind of human life that has never happened, and that would be entirely ordinary to the person living it. It begins aboard a vessel already in flight. It ends aboard the same vessel, still in flight. Between those 2 points, there is a full human existence, complete with childhood and work and love and old age, and none of it takes place on a world. The subject of this account is not the ship. The ship is only the structure that person happens to be standing inside, and it is the only structure that person will ever stand inside. A generation ship is a vehicle built to carry a human population across the distance between stars at a speed far below the speed of light. It is designed around a single accepted fact. The people who board it and the people who step off it at the far end are not the same people, and cannot be, because the crossing outlasts them. The nearest star system to the Sun lies about 4¼ light-years away. At 1% of the speed of light, that crossing takes roughly 436 years. At 5%, about 85 years. At 10%, about 44 years. At 12%, about 36 years. Only the slowest of those figures sits comfortably outside anything we know how to build, and it is the one that produces a true generation ship. It is the version in which someone is born in the middle, with no memory of a departure and no expectation of an arrival. That is the version we are following. Assume a crossing measured in centuries rather than decades. Assume a person born somewhere near the middle of it. Everything that follows is about that person and about the physical circumstance they are handed at birth without ever agreeing to it. Begin with weight, because weight is the first thing a body learns. Aboard a ship in deep space, there is no gravity in the ordinary sense. There is no world underneath to pull anything down. What there is instead is rotation. A cylinder or a ring, spun about its own axis, presses everything inside it outward against the inner wall. That outward press is not a trick, and it is not an illusion. For nearly every purpose a human body cares about, it is weight. The relationship that governs it is simple and unforgiving. The apparent gravity equals the square of the rotation rate multiplied by the radius. Spin faster or build wider, and the floor pushes harder. That single equation sets the shape of every generation ship ever seriously sketched, because it forces a trade between size and speed. To produce one full Earth gravity at 2 rotations per minute, the radius must be about 224 meters. To produce the same gravity at 1 rotation per minute, the radius has to grow to about 895 meters. To produce it at 4 rotations per minute, the radius falls to about 56 meters. A slower spin is gentler on the inner ear and enormously more expensive to build. A faster spin is cheap and hard on the body. The inner ear is what decides where that line falls. Rotating rooms have been built on the ground and lived in for days at a time, and the findings from them are consistent. At 1 rotation per minute, even highly susceptible people were essentially free of symptoms. At 3 rotations per minute, people had symptoms but were not seriously impaired. At about 5.5 rotations per minute, only those with low susceptibility performed well, and most of them were comfortable by the second day. At 10 rotations per minute, adaptation was still incomplete after 12 days. A later human systems standard concluded that most people with no prior experience can tolerate up to 6 rotations per minute about any axis at all. So the ship spins somewhere in that range, and everyone aboard lives inside the consequences. The first consequence is that weight is not the same everywhere. Because the outward press scales directly with radius, a standing adult weighs slightly less at the head than at the feet. On Earth, this difference exists too, and it is so small that no instrument in ordinary life detects it. Aboard a rotating habitat, it is a real, measurable gradient, and the smaller the ship, the steeper it becomes. Lying down removes it. Standing up restores it. Climbing toward the axis reduces total weight with every step. The second consequence is that movement itself changes weight. Walking in the direction of the spin adds to the apparent gravity. Walking against it subtracts. In a habitat of about 224 meters radius, turning twice a minute, an ordinary walking pace shifts apparent body weight by roughly 6%. In a smaller habitat, 56 meters across and turning 4 times a minute, the same walk shifts it by around 12%. A person aboard is heavier going one way down a corridor than the other every single time for their entire life. The third consequence is the one that matters most for a child, and we will come back to it repeatedly. Anything thrown, dropped or poured aboard a rotating ship does not travel in a straight line. It curves. The sideways acceleration acting on a moving object equals twice the rotation rate multiplied by the object's speed. In the 2 rotations per minute case, an object thrown at 10 meters per second feels a sideways push of about 4 meters per second squared. That is a substantial fraction of the ship's own artificial gravity, applied at right angles to the throw. Over a single second of flight, it pushes the object roughly 2 meters off the line it was thrown along. 2 meters is not a subtlety. It is the difference between catching something and watching it sail past. That is the mechanical world. The chemical world is closed. Air, water, and food aboard do not come from a planet, because there is no planet. They come from machinery, and that machinery runs continuously for centuries. On long-duration stations in orbit, the environmental system is built from 3 linked pieces. A water recovery system reclaims urine, sweat, and the humidity of the cabin air and returns about 90% of the station's water, with a demonstrated record recovery close to 98%. An air revitalization system pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere using molecular sieves and strips trace contaminants shed by electronics, plastics, and human bodies through charcoal beds and catalytic oxidizers. An oxygen generation system splits water electrically into oxygen and hydrogen, releases the oxygen into the cabin, and feeds the hydrogen together with the crew's exhaled carbon dioxide into a reactor whose products are methane, vented away, and more water. Every one of those processes has a sound. Pumps, fans, compressors, filters, the movement of air through ducts. Measured background levels aboard a real orbital station run between about 56 and 69 A-weighted decibels. The limits set for crews keep exposure below 72 decibels across a 16-hour working day and below 62 decibels for sleep. A separate sleep standard sets 50 decibels, and the quietest measured sleep station came in at 51. Hearing protection is recommended wherever the round-the-clock average exceeds 60. That sound is the acoustic floor of every moment of a ship-borne life. It never stops, and it never varies much, and we will return to what that does to a person who has never heard anything else. The ship also has a window. Somewhere in its structure there is a viewport, and through it the outside is visible. Through that viewport, the stars do not appear to move. Across an entire human lifetime, the view changes by an amount too small to see without instruments. That is simply a fact about the hardware and about the distances involved, and for now, it can be set down and left alone. One number remains, and it is the number that decides whether any life aboard is possible at all. In deep space, outside the protection of a planetary magnetic field, the measured radiation dose rate is about 1 4/5 millisieverts per day. Left unshielded, that comes to something on the order of 2/3 of a sievert every year. Across a long human life, it integrates to a figure many times over what a body can survive. Shielding, then, is not a comfort feature of a generation ship. It is the precondition for there being any people aboard to talk about. And it is the reason the story of a ship-borne life begins not with a birth, but with a decision about where a pregnancy is allowed to happen. A birth aboard a generation ship is not a private event. It is an allocation. It draws mass, air, water, calories and shielded volume from a total that cannot be increased, and it commits the ship to supporting a new person for 80 years. Everything that happens before the subject of this account exists is decided by other people using arithmetic. Before any of it, there is a gap in the evidence that needs stating plainly, because it sits underneath every claim in this episode. No human being has ever been conceived, gestated, or born anywhere other than Earth. The only two gravity levels that human bodies have ever experienced are one full gravity and approximately none. Everything in between, which is the entire range a rotating habitat would actually operate in, is unmeasured. There is no data on human development at 4/10 of a gravity, or 7/10, or 9/10. Not because nobody thought to collect it, but because no human has ever developed there. What exists instead is a scattering of animal work, and it points in a consistent direction. One small freshwater fish has completed a full mating and hatching cycle in orbit, producing healthy offspring. Vertebrate reproduction away from a planet is therefore not impossible in principle, and that is a genuinely useful thing to know. Beyond that, the record thins quickly. Newborn rodents flown in orbit for a little over 2 weeks showed measurably fewer mature, age-appropriate writing responses on their return than ground animals of exactly the same age. Placed in water, they floated at a steeper body angle, began swimming sooner, and swam faster. That is not a delay in development. It is a different strategy, arrived at by a nervous system that had been calibrated by different information. Rodents whose prenatal development took place in orbit showed reduced writing responses on the 1st and 3rd days after birth, and by the 5th day, the deficit had resolved entirely. So the effect is real, it is measurable, and it appears to be temporary. And there is one further detail that deserves to be stated without softening. Neonatal mortality among the animals carried on that flight was high enough that the developmental team had to reprioritize its experiments partway through the mission. That is the clearest single signal available about how fragile the very earliest stage of life is, when it is moved off a planet. A generation ship would therefore be running that experiment for the first time, on itself, with no control group, no external oversight, and no way to stop once it had started. Whatever the true answer turns out to be about human development under partial gravity, the ship finds it out one child at a time. The second constraint on a birth is dose. Recall the figure from the deep space environment. About 1 4/5 millisieverts per day, unshielded, outside any planetary magnetic field. Pregnancy is the most radiation-sensitive interval in a human life, and the developing nervous system is the most sensitive tissue within it. On a ship, that biological fact converts directly into architecture. There will be one part of the vessel more heavily shielded than the rest. Almost certainly it will be a volume wrapped in water tanks, stored waste, and the accumulated mass of the agricultural decks, because hydrogen-rich material breaks up incoming particles more efficiently than dense metal does for the same mass. Gestation will happen inside that volume, whether or not anyone ever writes it down as a rule, which produces one of the quieter oddities of a ship-borne life. The safest place on the vessel is also the most enclosed. The first months of that life are spent in the section with the thickest walls, the least view, and the most machinery pressed close on every side. The place that protects is the place that encloses, and there is no version of the design in which those two are separated. The third constraint is the ledger, and the ledger is set by biology rather than by policy. A closed population has a carrying capacity fixed by the slowest recovering loop aboard, and that loop is almost never water or power. It is food and atmosphere. Sealed ecological experiments on the ground make the point better than any calculation. A large sealed facility ran a 2-year closure during which atmospheric oxygen declined steadily, at an average of roughly 140 parts per million per day across the first 16 months. Finding the cause took considerable effort. Uncured concrete inside the structure had been quietly absorbing carbon dioxide, undoing the expected balance between what the plants produced and what everything else consumed. A building material was eating the air. In the same facility, all of the pollinating insects died. Most of the vertebrate species died. Cockroaches and ants became dominant. The internal ocean acidified, and the internal temperature proved extremely difficult to hold steady. A separate closed system, built around a crew area, an algal cultivator, and 2 plant chambers growing wheat and vegetables, supported up to 3 people through 10 closure experiments, the longest of them lasting 180 days. Even that one was never fully closed. Power came from outside, dried meat was imported, and human waste was dried and stored rather than recycled. The lesson from both is the same, and it is not the lesson people expect. Closed ecologies do not usually fail through the dramatic breakdown anyone planned for. They fail slowly, through drift in a variable nobody was watching, discovered long after it started. On a ship, that lesson has a demographic consequence. The number of people aboard is not a preference. It is a number the machinery sets, and it can be revised downward by a chemistry problem discovered too late. Which means permission to have a child becomes a shipboard institution. Administrative, routine, entirely ordinary to everyone involved, and profoundly strange from the outside. Underneath the demographic ledger, there is a genetic one. A sealed founding population carries a fixed pool of variation that can only ever narrow. Every pairing either preserves diversity or reduces it, and the reduction is permanent. So pairing aboard is never a purely private matter either. The subject of this account will one day sit on the other side of that conversation and will find it unremarkable because it will be the only version they have ever known. Finally, There is the pregnancy itself, carried under conditions no medical tradition on Earth has ever addressed. The mother is spinning. Her inner ear receives rotational information no human ancestor received. Fluid distribution through her body is altered by the reduced effective weight. Her immune function, if the orbital evidence transfers at all, is running below its normal competence, with altered white cell distribution and reduced activity in the cells that police infection. There is more to say about that immune picture because it shapes the whole of the life that follows. In long-duration cruise, immune dysregulation shows up as a recognizable pattern rather than as a vague weakening. White cell populations shift in their distribution. T-cell function drops. The activity of natural killer cells, which handle infected and abnormal cells, falls measurably. Signaling molecules in the blood shift away from their normal balance. The practical result is that infections the body had already contained can return. Roughly half of crew members on long missions shed viral material from one or more of the 9 known human herpes viruses, and both the frequency and the amount rise on missions of 60 to 180 days compared with flights of 2 weeks. Reactivation tracks the daily rise and fall of the body's main stress hormone, which ties a biological outcome directly to the psychological environment a person is living in. A newborn arriving into that environment faces a second and quieter problem. The immune system is not finished at birth. It calibrates itself in early life against whatever it encounters, and a sealed ship offers less to encounter than any environment in which a human infant has ever developed. Built spaces carry far less microbial diversity than outdoor ones, and reduced early life microbial exposure is associated with higher rates of allergy and immune-mediated disease rather than lower. A scrupulously clean ship may be assembling a population of exquisitely sensitive immune systems, one child at a time, for entirely well-intentioned reasons. And there is no transfer to a better-equipped facility, because there is no elsewhere. The ship's medical bay is the highest level of care that exists, that has ever existed on this voyage, and that ever will. Whatever it can do, it can do. Whatever it cannot, nobody can. There is at least a partial answer available, and it comes from the agricultural decks. Living plants measurably increase both the abundance and the diversity of microbial life in built environments. A growing space aboard a ship is therefore doing 4 jobs at once. It produces food. It processes carbon dioxide. It buffers humidity. And it supplies the microbial variety that a sealed hull otherwise strips out of a childhood. The crops actually grown and eaten in orbit so far are a short list and a revealing one. Several varieties of lettuce, Chinese cabbage, Mizuna mustard, red Russian kale, radish, and chili peppers, alongside flowering plants grown for no nutritional reason whatsoever. That last detail is not sentimental. Fresh growing things aboard a sealed vessel are valued explicitly as recreation and morale, not only as calories, and a generation ship would carry them for both reasons at once. Against all of that, the ship goes ahead anyway, because a generation that does not have children ends the voyage as completely as a reactor failure, and does so far more quietly. And so, in a shielded volume near the center of a spinning cylinder somewhere between 2 stars, a person begins. A human infant does not arrive as a blank surface. It arrives with a set of reflexes already running, present in the womb, and functioning from the first minutes. Those reflexes are the raw material from which all voluntary movement is later assembled, and 4 of them matter here. There is the startle reflex, which fires when support is abruptly lost. There is the asymmetrical neck reflex, which turns the body toward a turned head. There is the crawling reflex. And there is the tonic labyrinthine reflex, which adjusts muscle tone across the entire body according to the position of the head relative to gravity. That last one deserves a moment. Long before an infant can focus its eyes or recognize a face, its whole body muscle tone is being modulated by an organ whose only job is to measure which way is down. Tip the head back, and tone shifts one way across the trunk and limbs. Tip it forward, and tone shifts the other. None of this is learned. It is wiring, laid down in advance, and it assumes a planet. Aboard a rotating ship, that organ receives a signal no infant in the history of the species has received. The direction of down is correct, and it is steady. Rotation produces a genuine, constant outward acceleration, and the small crystal-loaded structures of the inner ear register it exactly as they would register weight on a world. In that sense, nothing is wrong. The floor is down, reliably, all the time. But the magnitude of down changes with height. A lifted infant weighs slightly less than a lowered one, by an amount the habitat's radius decides. Being picked up is not only a change in position aboard a spinning ship, it is a small, consistent change in weight. And down acquires a sideways component whenever the head moves out of the plane of rotation. This is the cross-coupled response, and it is the central sensory fact of life in a rotating habitat. A rotation about one axis, performed inside a body that is already rotating about another, produces the sensation of tumbling about a third axis entirely. On Earth, this sensation appears only in illness or in a spinning chair. Aboard, it appears every time a head turns while the body is moving. In adults arriving from a planet, this is the dominant source of discomfort, and it is what all the rotation rate research is really about. Adaptation is measured in days at moderate spin rates and remains incomplete after nearly 2 weeks at high ones. People do adapt. They adapt by building a new internal model on top of the old one, and the old one never quite goes away. In an infant, there is nothing to adapt from. The cross-coupled sensation is not an anomaly being corrected against a prior understanding of the world. It is the first understanding of the world. Whatever the inner ear learns in that first year, it learns as simply true. This is the central claim of this account, and it deserves to be said carefully. The ship-born infant is not being harmed by the ship's rotation. The infant is being calibrated by it. The nervous system does what nervous systems have always done, which is to build a model of the physical world out of whatever the physical world is actually doing, and then trust it completely. Which means that an adult who came aboard from Earth, reaching to steady a drifting object and missing because the object curved, is not demonstrating a hazard to the watching child. The adult is demonstrating something faintly comic. The object behaved correctly. The adult did not. There is a second layer to the reflex story, and it arrives a few weeks after birth. The primitive reflexes present at birth do not last. They are replaced over the first months and years by writing reflexes, which develop after birth and then remain for the rest of the person's life. Writing reflexes are the body's permanent answer to a sudden loss of balance. They are what turns a stumble into a recovered step instead of a fall. The labyrinthine head-writing reflex begins to appear around the second month as the infant learns to lift its head into line with its body. On Earth, that lift is a straightforward act against a uniform pull. Aboard a rotating ship, that same lift crosses a small but genuine gravity gradient, and it does so while the head passes into and out of the plane of rotation. The reflex forms anyway. It forms against that information, because that information is what is available. The rodent evidence suggests these systems are more forgiving than they might appear. Animals whose prenatal development took place in orbit showed reduced writing on the first and third days after birth, and complete recovery by the fifth. Plasticity in the vestibular system is real, and it is fast. Whatever the ship does to a developing sense of balance, the developing sense of balance appears to be built to absorb it. Alongside the vestibular story, 3 ordinary things are happening in that first year, and each of them will shape the whole of the life that follows. The first is sound. The ship never goes quiet. Somewhere between 56 and 69 decibels of continuous machine noise is not loud, and nobody would call it unpleasant. What it is permanent. It is the background beneath every word the infant will ever hear, and human infants learn speech precisely by extracting a signal from a background. On Earth, that background comes and goes. Rooms fall silent. Nights are quieter than days. Aboard, it does not vary, and it does not stop. Whether that produces a population with a lifelong tolerance for noise, or a population with subtly compressed hearing, or no measurable difference at all, is exactly the kind of question a ship would answer the slow way, across generations, without ever being able to compare its answer against anything. The second is light, and here the day itself is manufactured. The infant's day is a schedule rather than a phenomenon. Somewhere in the ship's systems, a lighting program brightens and dims across 24 hours, because human circadian biology needs a 24-hour signal and does not generate one reliably on its own. The evidence for how much this matters comes from orbit, where the natural light and dark cycle runs at 90 minutes rather than a day, and where the consequences are unambiguous. Measured sleep falls to around 6.5 hours. Subjective sleep quality drops. Wakefulness during the sleep period rises. Slow-wave sleep in the final third of the night is reduced, which is the portion most closely associated with memory consolidation and with growth hormone release. The amplitude of the body's own temperature rhythm flattens out. The recommended correction is a rigorously imposed artificial cycle, held to 24 hours regardless of what is visible outside. So a generation ship's day is an engineering product. It is maintained deliberately and continuously, in the same category as cabin pressure and atmospheric composition, and it is maintained for exactly as long as there are people aboard to need it. There is a practical consequence of that sleep finding worth noting, because it does not stay in the nursery. Sleep-promoting medication use among long-duration crews is high enough to be a standing operational concern. A generation ship inherits that concern permanently and has to solve it for centuries without resupply, using whatever it can manufacture aboard. A lighting program that works is therefore not merely a comfort. It is the cheapest available substitute for a pharmacy that cannot be restocked. There is also a documented effect running the other way. Infants raised in acoustically noisy homes show measurable differences in how finely they discriminate speech sounds. The ship is a permanently noisy home, and there is no visiting anywhere else, and no quieter house down the road. Whatever that does, it does to everyone aboard equally, which means nobody aboard will ever be positioned to notice it. The third is contact, meaning contact with everything that is not human. A closed habitat carries less microbial diversity than any environment in which an infant has ever developed, and the immune system calibrates itself against what it meets. Meeting less is associated with more allergy and more immune-mediated disease. A ship with soil, crops, and a working agricultural deck is therefore doing something meaningfully different from a ship kept surgically clean, and probably something considerably better. There is one more feature of the ship worth naming here, because it will matter for years. In any rotating habitat, there is a region along the central axis where the outward press falls to nothing. It is a genuine zero-gravity volume, and it is the only place aboard where a ship-borne body experiences what orbital crews experience continuously. Whether the ship's physicians encourage infants and small children to spend time there, believing varied gravity exposure to be protective, or restrict it, believing it destabilizing, is a policy question with no evidence behind it in either direction. It will be decided by argument and then inherited as tradition. By the end of that first year, the subject of this account has a functioning body, a vestibular system tuned to a spinning cylinder rather than to a world, an ear that treats a machine hum as silence, a day produced by a lighting controller, an immune system trained on whatever happened to be aboard. None of it feels like anything. It is simply what a body is and what the world is, and there has never been any other version of either. Between roughly 1 and 5 years old, a human being converts a body into a set of habits. Walking, reaching, throwing, catching, climbing, falling and recovering are all installed in that window, and once installed, they run without conscious attention for the rest of the person's life. This is the stretch in which the ship stops being a place the child is kept and becomes the physics the child is made of. Start with walking. A child learns to walk by falling repeatedly and by building a predictive model of how falling works. That model is not written down anywhere. It lives in the muscles and in the parts of the brain that never speak. Aboard a rotating ship, that model has to accommodate 3 additions to ordinary weight, and it accommodates all 3 without ever naming them. The first addition is that weight depends on height above the floor. Standing up reduces the apparent weight of the head relative to the feet. Lying down removes the gradient entirely. Climbing reduces total weight measurably with every rung. On Earth, this effect exists and is far too small to matter. Aboard, it is a normal part of what moving around feels like. The second addition is that weight depends on the direction of travel. Running with the spin makes the body heavier. Running against it makes the body lighter. In a habitat of around 224 meters radius turning twice a minute, an ordinary walk moves apparent body weight by about 6%, and a run moves it considerably further. In a smaller habitat, 56 meters across, and turning 4 times a minute, a walk alone shifts weight by roughly 12%. 12% is something a body notices. It is the difference between carrying a heavy bag and setting it down. The shipborne child grows up with that difference built into direction itself, so that spinward and anti-spinward are not merely 2 ways along a corridor. They are 2 different weights. The third addition is that falling is not vertical. An object released from rest relative to the ship's structure does not drop straight down. It drifts spinward as it falls, along a shallow curve, and lands slightly ahead of the point it was released from. An adult who arrived from a planet finds all 3 of those disorienting and corrects for them consciously and never entirely stops noticing. The shipborne child never learns the version without them. Their walking model has spin in it from the first step, in exactly the way an Earth-raised child's walking model has air resistance in it without anyone ever mentioning air. Throwing is where the difference becomes visible from the outside, and it is worth returning to the number. The sideways acceleration acting on a moving object equals twice the ship's rotation rate multiplied by the object's speed. In a habitat turning twice a minute, an object thrown at 10 meters per second experiences a sideways push of about 4 meters per second squared, applied continuously at right angles to the throw. Over a single second of flight, that pushes it roughly 2 meters off the line it left the hand along. So every ball game invented aboard a generation ship is a game about a curve. Throws made along the spin axis travel straight. Throws made across it bend. The shipborne child learns that distinction long before anyone explains why it exists, in the same way children on Earth learn that a thrown ball arcs downward without ever being told about gravity. A child throwing something to a friend across a corridor aims visibly to one side, and it arrives exactly where it was meant to. Nobody comments. That is simply how throwing works. An adult raised on a planet would find those games close to unplayable, and the child would find that funny, and would probably not be able to explain what the adult was doing wrong. Pouring is the same problem at lower speed. A stream of liquid poured from any height curves as it falls, and the curve gets worse the further it goes. Shipboard kitchens would develop pouring habits that look slightly wrong to an Earth-raised eye, and would be entirely correct. Climbing changes character too. Moving toward the ship's axis makes the climber progressively lighter, which turns a ladder into something Earth has no equivalent of. It is hardest at the bottom, and it eases the whole way up, and the last few rungs take almost nothing at all. There is a further consequence hidden inside that, and it concerns alarm. The startle response to a sudden loss of support is calibrated to a particular acceleration. It fires when the body detects that it is falling faster than it expected to. In a habitat running below one full gravity, that calibration is set lower because the falls the child has experienced have all been slower and gentler than falls on a planet. The shipborne body's threshold for alarm at a drop is therefore different, tuned to a world that pulls less hard. It is a small thing. It is also the sort of small thing that decides whether a person flinches. Rotating simulator work adds an interesting complication here. Walking in the direction of spin was found to be most comfortable at somewhere between roughly 1/6 and 3/10 of a full gravity, which is well below Earth normal. That suggests a habitat deliberately run at reduced gravity might actually be more pleasant to move around in, even while it is worse for the bones of everyone moving around in it. Comfort and health do not point the same way, and a ship's designers would have had to choose. There is one more adaptation that would happen without anyone deciding on it. Head movements out of the plane of rotation produce the cross-coupled sensation. Head movements within that plane do not. A population living inside a spinning cylinder would gradually develop unconscious movement habits that minimize the first kind, in exactly the way people everywhere unconsciously avoid movements that hurt. The shipborne body would hold its head differently while turning, and would not know that it did. Now the harder part, which is space itself, and which will follow this person for 80 years. Human spatial cognition is built on a horizon. Depth perception past a few meters relies on cues that assume an open scene. Parallel lines converging toward a vanishing point. Distant objects losing contrast and taking on the color of the air between. Near things sliding across far things as the head moves. Every one of those cues is a measurement of an open world, and a child raised entirely inside a habitat encounters them only within the habitat's own dimensions. In a rotating cylinder, the ground does not recede toward a horizon. It rises. The floor curves upward in the direction of travel and keeps curving until it becomes the ceiling. In a large enough habitat, that curve is gentle enough to read as a very long, very slightly uphill road that never quite crests. In a smaller one, the ground visibly climbs ahead of the walker and closes overhead. The consequence is arithmetic rather than tragedy. The largest distance this child will ever see is the length of the ship. The largest open space is whatever volume the habitat's designers were willing to leave unpartitioned. Every experience of extent, every sense of something being far away is bounded by structure. This does not damage anyone. It simply means that far is a much smaller number for this person than it has been for any human in history, and that the number will never grow. There is no expedition that increases it. There is no hill to climb for a better view. The ship is the maximum. There is exactly one exception, and it is the viewport. Through it, the child can see genuinely unbounded distance. But it contains nothing that resolves into an object, nothing that moves at any pace a human can perceive, and nothing that can be walked toward. It offers distance without extent, which is very nearly the opposite of a horizon. There is also a climate, which is easy to overlook. Any large sealed volume develops its own weather. Warm air rises toward the axis, where the outward press is weaker, and cooler air settles toward the rim. Humidity pools in some sections and thins in others. Temperature layers form and persist. A habitat big enough to contain open space is big enough to have local conditions, and those conditions are the only weather this person will ever stand in. It is not rain and it is not wind. It is a faint, permanent circulation, and a child growing up inside it would learn which deck is warm in the late part of the lighting cycle in exactly the way children on Earth learn which side of the house catches the afternoon. And then there is the play environment itself, which contains one feature no playground on Earth has ever had. Along the ship's central axis, the outward press falls away to nothing. It is a real zero-gravity volume, and to any child aboard it is the single most attractive place on the vessel. It is also the one place where the whole body's model of down goes quiet, and where the shipborne child briefly experiences what orbital crews experience continuously. Whether that is good for a developing body, nobody knows. It might be protective, keeping the vestibular system flexible across a wider range of conditions than the habitat normally provides. It might be destabilizing, undermining the calibration the ship spent a year installing. There is no evidence either way. There never will be during this person's lifetime, and children will go there regardless, because children have always gone to the most interesting place available. By the end of this stretch, the subject of this account can run, climb, throw, catch and fall, in a world where running changes weight, climbing reduces it, and thrown objects bend 2 meters to one side. All of it feels ordinary. All of it is ordinary. It is simply what physics does, in the only place this person has ever been. Of all the systems in a shipborne body, the visual system is the one where the evidence is strongest, the mechanism is best understood, and the outcome is most likely to be permanent. This is not a speculative section. It is close to a prediction. A newborn eye is not the right length. Human eyes grow after birth, and they grow toward a target, which is the length at which distant objects come into focus exactly on the retina. That self-correcting growth is one of the more elegant pieces of biological engineering in the body. An organ measures its own optical performance and adjusts its own dimensions until the performance is right. The process is not driven by inheritance alone. It is driven by what the eye actually sees. And when it overshoots, the eye becomes slightly too long, and distant objects come to a focus in front of the retina rather than on it. That is short-sightedness, and its prevalence has risen sharply in population after population, wherever childhood has moved indoors. The evidence on why is unusually clear, and it is about light rather than about reading. That distinction matters because the folk explanation has always been close work, and close work turns out not to be the main lever. Daily outdoor exposure of between 40 minutes and 2 hours measurably slows the eye's elongation in children. The measured difference runs at about 0.08 of a millimeter of eye length per year, and about 1/6 of a diopter of refractive change per year, against children who stay indoors. Those differences appear within the first year of the intervention and hold for at least 3. More than 2 hours a day is more effective still, and the relationship is dose-dependent. More outdoor time gives more protection, in a smooth curve rather than at a threshold. 2 hours or more of daily outdoor activity reduces the rate of onset regardless of whether a child's parents are short-sighted, which cleanly separates the effect from inherited risk. In some populations, outdoor light programs have reduced the incidence of short-sightedness by around half and reduced eye elongation by roughly 1/4. The mechanism appears to be dopamine in the retina. Bright light triggers its release, and dopamine restrains the eye's growth. Light intensities between about 2,500 and 40,000 lux slow elongation, and they do so in proportion to their intensity. There is also evidence that the specific wavelengths present in daylight matter, including violet, which ordinary interior lighting largely lacks. The growth regulation system is also, importantly, local to the eye itself. It continues to operate even when the connection to the brain is compromised, which tells us the decision is being made inside the eye, by the eye, on the basis of the image landing on the retina. That is why the environmental input is so decisive. There is no higher authority overruling it. Whatever light the eye receives across a childhood is the instruction it follows, and it follows it for years, without appeal. There is a seasonal signature that makes the case even harder to argue with. Eye elongation in children runs faster in winter than in summer, tracking daylight hours directly. The eye is measuring the sky. Now set those numbers against a ship. Ordinary indoor lighting runs on the order of 100 to a few hundred lux. Overcast daylight outdoors is on the order of 10,000. Direct sunlight is tens of thousands and upward. The gap between the inside of any built environment and the outdoors is not a matter of degree. It is 1 to 3 orders of magnitude, and it is precisely the variable the eye is measuring. A generation ship has no outdoors. There is no version of the design in which one exists. Unless the ship's builders deliberately install lighting an order of magnitude brighter than any interior lighting humans have ever built for comfort, and then run it for hours every day, at real power cost, for centuries, on the strength of an argument about children's eyes, the shipborne population grows up under exactly the light levels associated with the fastest eye elongation on record. That is a solvable problem, and an easy one to fail to solve. High-intensity lighting is not exotic technology. It is a power budget and a decision. Whether a founding generation thought of it, wrote it into the design, and whether every generation afterward kept paying for it when other things needed power, is the kind of small inherited choice that quietly decides how a distant descendant sees. There is a second visual problem aboard, and this one arrives from the adults rather than from the children. Crews on long-duration missions develop a characteristic cluster of changes in the eye and in the brain behind it. Swelling of the optic disc, flattening of the back of the eyeball, folds appearing in the layers behind the retina, a shift in refraction toward long-sightedness of up to 1.5 diopters, which can appear within 3 weeks of arrival. Roughly 7 in 10 long-duration crew members show some part of the pattern. The leading explanation involves the redistribution of body fluid toward the head when weight is reduced, and the way that changes the pressure environment inside the skull. There is currently no direct treatment for it, and the changes are not always fully reversible. Whether that syndrome appears at all inside a rotating habitat is unknown, and it is one of the strongest arguments for spinning a generation ship rather than letting it coast unspun. Artificial gravity restores the head-to-foot fluid gradient, which is the presumed root of the whole problem. A ship that spins is, among other things, a ship trying to keep its people's eyes the correct shape. There is one more consequence worth drawing out, and it is a rare case where two shipboard problems share a single answer. Interior lighting bright enough to protect children's eyes would also be bright enough to maintain circadian entrainment in adults, which is the other thing the ship's lighting program is quietly fighting to preserve. The same lamps, the same hours, the same power draw solve a developmental problem in the young and a sleep problem in the old. Whether anyone aboard ever noticed that the two were connected is a separate question, and the ship would work better if they had. The fluid shift syndrome, meanwhile, is not confined to the eye. The same pressure changes produce measurable alterations in the structure of the brain and in how its functions reorganize themselves. So the eye is best understood as the visible end of something happening further in. It is the part that can be photographed, and therefore the part that gets a name. So the shipborne eye sits between two pressures pulling in opposite directions. An elongation pressure from a dim and close-range visual life, and a flattening pressure from altered fluid distribution, which the ship's rotation is specifically designed to remove. The likely outcome is a population for whom corrective lenses are simply part of being a person. Manufactured aboard, fitted young, entirely unremarkable, and common enough that nobody thinks of them as correction. Which means an optical workshop is not a luxury aboard a generation ship. It is a life support component, running for as long as there are people, because eyes cannot be regrown and lenses cannot be resupplied. And then there is a third thing, which is not a pathology at all, and which no medical system aboard would ever record. The furthest object this person ever focuses on is a wall. The muscles that pull focus out toward infinity are exercised only at the viewport and only against a field of points that never resolve into anything. The physical act of looking at something far away, the relaxation of the lens, the widening of attention, the small involuntary release that comes with a long view, is something the shipborne person performs perhaps a few thousand times across an entire life. Deliberately. At a piece of transparent alloy, in a corridor, on purpose. On Earth, that release is free and constant. It happens every time anyone steps outside and looks up, without intention, hundreds of times a day, from the moment they can see. Aboard, it is a thing a person goes to do. There is no distress in this. The shipborne person does not feel the absence, because there is no comparison available, and an eye that has never focused on a mountain does not know that mountains were an option. It is simply a different way of using a pair of eyes, for 80 years, and it is the only way this person will ever know. Somewhere in middle childhood, the subject of this account learns where they are. Not the name of the ship, which they have always known, and not the direction of travel, which is a fact in a lesson. What they learn is the shape of the world, and that it has an edge, and what is on the other side of that edge. Every child learns a geography. On Earth, that geography is nested and open. A room inside a building, inside a town, inside a country, inside a world, inside a sky. Each layer is larger than the one before it, and each of them is, at least in principle, reachable. The Earth-raised child learns that the world continues past what can be seen, and that this continuation is normal, and that other people are living in it right now. The shipborne child learns a geography that terminates. There is the compartment, and the deck, and the section, and the ship. And then there is nothing. Not more space that happens to be far away, but the absence of any further category at all. The hull is not a boundary between here and elsewhere. It is the boundary between here and not a place. This is not a trauma. It is learned at the same age and with the same casualness that an earth-raised child learns that the sea is salty or that fire is hot. But it produces a genuinely different mind, and the difference has 3 parts, each of which will run for 80 years. The first is that the concept of outside is inverted. On Earth, outside means the larger, older, more real place from which every built environment has been carved. Outside is where things grow. Outside is where you go to feel better. Aboard, outside, means the vacuum. It is instantly and completely fatal. It has no features. It cannot be entered without a machine, and even then, only briefly and with permission. The shipborne child learns that inside is the world, and outside is the hazard, and those 2 facts sit at the foundation of everything else they will ever think about space. The second is that Earth becomes historical rather than geographical. It is not a place this child might one day visit. It is a place in the archive. Described, imaged, recorded, catalogued, and unreachable. It occupies the same mental category as any other thing known only from records, and the child has no way to distinguish it from one. The third is that the destination is historical too, in the other direction. The target system is described, measured, and equally unreachable within this life. So both ends of the voyage exist for this person as documents. The place they came from and the place they are going are the same kind of thing, and neither of them is anywhere they will stand. This is where the shipborne life diverges most sharply from every human life before it, and it deserves to be said carefully and without drama. Every human being in history has lived inside a story with a somewhere else in it. Even the most isolated communities on Earth have had a horizon, a coastline, a mountain range, a rumor of other people over the ridge. The possibility of elsewhere has been a constant of the species. The shipborne person is the first human whose world is fully enumerated. They can, in principle, have been in every room they will ever be in by the age of 10. Not most of them. All of them. There is a fourth difference, and it is social rather than spatial. Every shipborne person is on first-name terms with a large fraction of everyone who exists. In a population of a few thousand, the social world is small enough to be fully known, and it is known by the age of 12. There are no strangers aboard. There is no crowd of unfamiliar faces on any deck, no anonymity in any corridor, and no possibility of being unrecognized anywhere. The ordinary human experience of moving unnoticed through a place full of people who do not know you does not exist aboard, and never has. The child's mental map is different too. An earth-raised person carries a map of a town that is essentially flat, a network of streets on a surface. The shipborne child carries a map that is genuinely 3-dimensional, navigated in all 3 axes as a matter of routine, with the axis above and the rim below and decks stacked between them. That is not a poorer map. It is a richer one, of a smaller thing. The correct register for this is not tragedy. It is the mild, matter-of-fact strangeness of a person who has never once wondered what is over the hill, because there is no hill and there is no over. It does not feel like a wall to them. It feels like the shape of things. What partially fills the gap is the archive, and the archive is... A generation ship carries the accumulated record of a species. Images, recordings, texts, music, maps, films of weather, films of animals, films of crowds moving through cities. In terms of raw information, the shipborne child grows up knowing more about Earth than most people who actually lived on it ever did. What they do not have is the referent. They know exactly what rain looks like, and sounds like, and does to a surface. They have never once been wet from the sky. They know the sound of wind in trees as a recording. They know the smell of soil, if the ship has agricultural decks, and they know the smell of an ocean not at all. There is a further complication in the archive itself, and it grows worse with time. Language drifts. A sealed population, separated from every other speaker of its language for centuries, develops its own accent, then its own idiom, then eventually its own language. Meanwhile, the recordings in the archive do not change at all. So each generation finds the founding voices very slightly more archaic than the last did, until listening to them becomes an exercise in translation. Nothing is lost. Nothing is deleted. The population simply moves, slowly and without noticing, away from its own founding documents. And the archive is a hazard as well as a resource, in one specific way. A population that knows Earth intimately through records and can never verify a single frame of it has an entirely trust-based relationship with its own history. Everything the shipborne person believes about where the species came from rests on the honesty and the competence of people who died centuries before they were born. There is reasonable evidence that this absence carries a cost, and it is not a sentimental one. Exposure to natural environments produces measurable psychological restoration. Recovery of directed attention. Reduction in stress markers. Improvement in mood. The effect appears to depend on 4 things. Being away from the demands of ordinary life. Fascination that holds attention without demanding it. A sense of a coherent environment that extends beyond the immediate view. And a fit between the setting and what the person actually needs. The supporting findings are consistent. Hospital patients with a view of nature have recovered faster after surgery than those without one. People with green space near their homes are measurably less affected by stressful life events. And the restorative power of a green space scales with its biodiversity rather than simply with its area, which means the effect depends on how genuinely alive the setting is, not on how much of it there is. A ship can supply exactly one of those 4 ingredients easily, and that is fascination. Moving water and moving leaves both have it. What a ship cannot build is a coherent environment extending beyond the view, because there is nothing beyond the view. Its best available answer is the agricultural decks, which argues strongly that the growing spaces aboard a generation ship should be large, varied, walkable, and genuinely beautiful. Not because that would be pleasant. Because it is the closest thing to a countermeasure the vessel can carry, and because there is decent evidence that many species do it better than efficient monoculture would. Before this account eases onward into education, work, parenthood, and age, it is worth restacking what has been established, because none of it changes again. The ship is a spinning cylinder whose gravity is a function of radius and whose physics puts a curve into every thrown object. The subject was conceived by permission inside the most heavily shielded volume aboard because the dose rate outside it runs at about 1 4/5 millisieverts per day. The subject was born into a population whose size is set by the slowest loop in the life support system, in a world where children must be allocated rather than simply arrive. The subject's sense of balance was calibrated by rotation rather than by a planet, and holds cross-coupled sensation to be a normal feature of turning ahead. The subject's day is a lighting program, maintained like cabin pressure. The subject's ear treats a machine hum as silence, because it has never once stopped. The subject's immune system was trained on whatever the ship happened to be carrying, which is less than any human immune system has ever had to work with. The subject's eyes grew up under interior light and will very probably need correcting. And now, In middle childhood, the subject has learned that the world is finite, that it can be fully enumerated, and that both the origin and the destination of this voyage exist only as records held in a machine. From here, the life continues. What follows is education, and work, and love, and children, and age. And not one of the facts above ever changes again. Between roughly 6 and 16, the subject of this account is educated. That education has a structural problem no school on Earth has ever faced, because it has to transmit two entirely different bodies of knowledge for two entirely different reasons, with limited time available for both. The first body of knowledge is operational. The ship must not fail, and the people who keep it from failing have to be replaced continuously across centuries without a single gap. Reactor operation, life support chemistry, agricultural management, medicine, materials fabrication, structural repair, software maintenance. Each of those has to be held at genuine working competence by enough people in every generation, forever. If any one of them lapses for a single generation, it has to be rebuilt from documentation, and documentation is a far weaker teacher than a living practitioner. The second body is cultural. It is everything the ship carries about being human that is not required to keep the ship running. History, literature, music, art, law. The reasons the voyage was undertaken at all. None of it is load-bearing in an engineering sense. All of it is load-bearing in every other sense, and a ship that drops it arrives with a population that no longer has any particular reason to have come. The evidence from institutions on Earth is consistent about which of those transmits well. Identity, practice, and belief can carry across 1,000 years. Specific operational competence cannot. Skills decay unless they are exercised continuously, against real demand, by people who face real consequences when they get it wrong. The oldest continuously operating enterprises on Earth have persisted for something like 14 centuries, and they did it by serving an external demand that kept their skills sharp the entire time. A generation ship has no external demand. There is no customer. There is no competitor. Whatever keeps its competences exercised has to be arranged deliberately, by people, on purpose, in every generation. Which means shipboard education cannot be theoretical. A person has to actually repair the actual systems, on the actual hardware, with actual consequences, or what they possess is a description rather than a skill. Apprenticeship rather than instruction. Something closer to a guild than to a school. It also means the ship has to maintain redundancy in people, not merely in hardware. Every critical competence needs more holders than the strict minimum, because the strict minimum is one accident away from zero, and a competence that reaches zero has to be reconstructed from a manual written by someone who assumed a reader who no longer exists. That last point is worth pausing on, because it is the quiet failure mode of every archive ever assembled. Documentation degrades as a teacher, not because the words change, but because the reader does. A manual written 4 generations ago was written for someone with a particular background, a particular vocabulary, and a particular set of things they already knew. As the population drifts, the assumed reader drifts out of existence, and the manual becomes progressively harder to follow while remaining perfectly legible. For the subject of this account, all of this arrives as an unusually early and unusually concrete relationship with work. A shipborne adolescent is not being prepared for an open field of possible futures. They are being fitted to a finite set of necessary roles, in a population small enough that the fit genuinely matters to everyone. At some point, a teenager is shown the list. Not an aptitude assessment. An actual roster of the roles that must be filled across the next 20 years, and how many people are currently trained for each of them. It is not presented as a limitation. It is presented as the ordinary shape of a future, in the same tone that a school on Earth might describe a timetable. There is a real and permanent tension in that, and the ship-born adolescent feels it at exactly the age when Earth-raised adolescents are being told they can become anything. It is not cruelty. It is arithmetic. But it is arithmetic applied to a person, and people notice. A small population also cannot support deep specialization the way a large one can. On Earth, a city of 10 million can afford someone who does nothing but one narrow thing extremely well. A ship of a few thousand cannot. So a ship-born adult is likely to hold several competencies at moderate depth rather than one at great depth, and to move between them across a working life, and to be the only person currently qualified for something more often than is comfortable. There is a further category of teaching that is stranger still. Any skill the ship will not need for centuries but will need on arrival has to be taught continuously to people who will never use it. Planetary surface work, atmospheric flight, geology, weather, the handling of an environment that is not sealed. Every generation must learn those, purely so that they still exist when the final generation finally requires them, and every generation knows perfectly well that they are learning them for someone else. The cultural half of the curriculum has its own oddities. The subject learns, in detail, about a world of weather and oceans and animals and cities and wars and migrations and seasons, none of which they will ever see, all of which supply the metaphors of the language they speak every day. That is one of the quieter strangenesses of a ship-born life. Human language is saturated with terrestrial reference. To be under the weather, to weather a storm, downhill, uphill, groundless, rooted, bogged down, snowed under, watershed. Every one of those phrases arrives in a ship-born mind as a definition rather than as an experience. The person uses them correctly, fluently, constantly, and has a purely archival relationship with what they mean. Over enough generations, the language drifts to match the place. New idioms form from shipboard experience. Spinward and anti-spinward become directions with a feel to them. Axis-ward becomes up. The vocabulary of decks and loops and rations and lighting cycles becomes the vocabulary of ordinary speech. And the old terrestrial idioms survive as pure convention, detached from anything, the way languages on Earth carry fossils of technologies nobody has used in centuries. The teaching of history aboard is unusually consequential, and it is worth separating from the rest of the cultural curriculum. On Earth, history is largely a matter of understanding how the present came about. Aboard, it is the load-bearing justification for continuing. The population's willingness to keep the voyage going rests entirely on a decision made by people none of them ever met, for reasons none of them can independently verify, on behalf of a destination none of them will reach. A generation that stops finding that persuasive does not mutiny. It simply stops maintaining things with quite the same care, and the ship notices before anyone else does. Written language holds up better than spoken language, which produces a slow and slightly melancholy shift in how the population reaches its own past. The recordings become progressively harder to follow as pronunciation drifts. The texts remain readable far longer because writing is conservative and speech is not. So access to the founding era moves, generation by generation, from listening to reading. The voices go first. The words stay. Music may transmit better than almost anything else in the archive, and for a specific reason. Music is practiced rather than merely stored. It passes from a person who can play to a person learning to play, which is the transmission method that survives. A recording is a description. A player is a skill. A ship that keeps its instruments in use keeps a living connection to a place none of its people have seen. Meanwhile, the physical environment supplies a curriculum nobody teaches. The subject learns the ship the way an earth-raised child learns a landscape, which is by moving through it constantly, at every age, in every mood, for years. By adolescence, they know the sound each section makes. Which corridors are warm? Where the air moves. Which deck is quietest, at which point in the lighting cycle? Which hatch sticks? Which floor plate rings hollow? There is one more thing the environment teaches, and it has no equivalent on a planet. The shipborne adolescent knows, physically, the difference between a system that is running normally and a system that is not. Not from instruments, but from sound and vibration and smell. A pump running slightly out of true, a fan bearing beginning to go, a scrubber cycling more often than it did last month. In a sealed vessel where every process is audible somewhere, an entire population develops a diagnostic sense for its own machinery. On Earth, only specialists have that relationship with equipment. Aboard, everyone does, because everyone lives inside it, and because a sound that changes is the earliest warning the ship ever gives. That is not trivial knowledge, and it is not lesser knowledge. It is the same kind of knowledge a person on Earth has of a home valley, learned in the same way, held with the same affection. It is simply the only version of it this person will ever have. The subject of this account is now physically adult, and this is where the question becomes concrete. What does a human body actually become when it has been assembled inside a sealed spinning cylinder, under partial gravity, permanent low-level radiation, closed-loop nutrition, and a reduced microbial environment for 20 uninterrupted years? The honest answer has to begin with the gap again, because it never closes. There is no data. Every figure in this section comes from either full gravity or approximately none, and a generation ship operates in between. What follows is the shape of the extrapolation. It is not a measurement, and it should not be mistaken for one. Bone is the clearest case, so begin there. Bone is not a static scaffold holding a body up. It is a living tissue that continuously rebuilds itself in response to mechanical stress, adding material where it is loaded and removing it where it is not. That process runs constantly, throughout life, in everyone. Remove the load, and the removal continues without the addition. In orbital conditions, weight-bearing bone is lost at roughly 1 to 2% per month. Losses of up to 20% have been recorded across a 6-month stay. Muscle responds faster still. Up to a fifth of skeletal muscle mass and up to a third of muscle strength can be lost within a single month without countermeasures, and unmitigated losses on long missions could approach half. What both tissues are actually responding to is mechanical stress, and mechanical stress is exactly what artificial gravity restores. This is the entire argument for spinning a ship rather than coasting it. Rotation is not there for comfort. It is there to keep skeletons. The critical unknown is the shape of the curve between 0 and 1. If bone maintenance scales roughly linearly with gravity, then a habitat running at 7/10ths of a gravity produces bodies with meaningfully reduced but stable skeletal mass, and everything is fine. If instead there is a threshold, a level above which maintenance is essentially normal and below which it steadily degrades, then the entire habitability of a generation ship depends on which side of that threshold its engineers happen to choose. And they chose it without knowing where the threshold is. For the subject of this account, the difference between those two possibilities is the difference between a normal body and a body that has been quietly underbuilt since before birth. And either way, they will never know from the inside. There is no comparison available. Nobody aboard has ever seen an Earth-raised adult of the same age who grew up under a full gravity. What is almost certainly true is that a ship-born adult is not shaped like an Earth-born one. Lower load through development plausibly means longer limbs, lighter bone, different proportions, and less muscle at rest. Whether that constitutes a health problem or simply a different normal depends entirely on where that unknown threshold sits, and the ship will find out by living long enough. There are secondary effects that follow from the same physics. Wound healing, fracture repair, and post-surgical recovery all draw on the same tissue-building processes affected by reduced load, which makes injury aboard plausibly a slower and more serious event than the identical injury on a planet. Kidney stone risk rises as bone demineralization loads the urinary system with calcium, which gives a low-gravity habitat a characteristic and predictable set of chronic conditions that everyone aboard would simply regard as the normal illnesses of adult life. Exercise helps, and only partly. Countermeasure programs in orbit are extensive, demanding, and still incompletely effective, which suggests that a well-designed habitat would build loading into the ordinary structure of daily life, rather than relying on anybody's willingness to exercise voluntarily for 80 years. Stairs instead of lifts. Distance between the places people need to be. Work that involves carrying things. Architecture as a treatment. There is one further effect of reduced weight that the ship's rotation exists specifically to prevent, and it belongs here rather than with the eyes. When weight is reduced, body fluid redistributes toward the head because there is no longer enough of a downward pull to hold the normal gradient in place. That redistribution is the presumed root of the eye and brain changes seen in long-duration crews, and it is the reason a spinning habitat is regarded as the strongest available countermeasure. Rotation restores the head-to-foot gradient. It puts the fluid back where the body has always expected it to be. A ship that spins is not only keeping skeletons, it is keeping the internal plumbing of the head running the way it evolved to run. The immune system is the second story, and here the orbital evidence is more direct and considerably more concerning. Long-duration crews show altered distribution of white blood cells, reduced T-cell function, and reduced activity in the natural killer cells that handle infected and abnormal tissue. Signaling molecules in the blood shift away from their normal balance. The practical consequence shows up as reactivation of infections the body had already contained. Roughly half of long-duration crew members shed viral material from one or more of the 9 known human herpes viruses, and both the frequency and the amount rise on missions of 60 to 180 days compared with 2-week flights. Reactivation tracks the daily rise and fall of the body's principal stress hormone, which ties the immune outcome directly to the psychological environment. Layer onto that the microbial poverty of any sealed environment. Built spaces carry far less microbial diversity than outdoor ones, and reduced early life exposure is associated with higher rates of allergy and immune-mediated disease rather than lower. So the ship-born adult carries an immune system that was trained on an unusually narrow set of inputs, and that is now operating under chronic low-grade suppression in a body that cannot leave. The consolation is real and worth stating plainly. A sealed population is also a population with no new pathogens. Whatever came aboard at departure is all there will ever be. Nothing arrives. Nothing crosses over from another species. Nothing emerges from a market or a farm or a forest. The shipborne adult lives in a world where nothing new can infect them, and where everything old may return. It is a genuinely different bargain from the one people on Earth have always made, and it is not obviously a worse one. There is a slower change happening underneath all of this that nobody aboard would ever perceive. A sealed population develops its own strains of ordinary commensal organisms over centuries. The bacteria living on a shipborne adult's skin and in their gut are descended from bacteria that boarded at departure and have been evolving inside a closed system ever since, without any exchange with the enormous microbial world they came from. By the time the voyage ends, the ship's microbial ecology is measurably distinct from the one it left with. The people aboard are not a sample of Earth anymore. They are a separate small biosphere, wearing Earth's descendants on the inside. Third, medicine. The ship's medical capability is fixed at whatever was loaded plus whatever can be manufactured aboard. There is no referral. There is no specialist elsewhere. There is no evacuation, and no resupply of anything that cannot be synthesized from what is already in the loops. Pharmaceuticals degrade. Some can be made aboard and some cannot, and the list of which is which was decided centuries ago by people making guesses. Surgical capability is limited by equipment, by consumables, and by something more interesting than either. In a population of a few thousand, a rare condition may appear once in a generation. The person who treats it will be doing so for the first time, having learned it entirely from documentation on someone they have known their whole life. That is not a failure of shipboard medicine. It is the arithmetic of a small population, and it is the ordinary condition of care aboard. Everyone knows it. Everyone accepts it. And every physician aboard lives with the knowledge that the hardest thing they ever do, they will do exactly once. There is also a dentistry problem, which sounds minor and is not. Teeth cannot be regrown. Dental materials have to be manufactured aboard indefinitely. And dental pain is one of the very few conditions that reliably makes an otherwise healthy person unable to work, in a population that cannot afford to lose anyone's labor for long. Fourth, food. The diet is whatever the agricultural decks produce, plus whatever the loops recover. Orbital crop experience so far amounts to a short list, grown at small scale. Several kinds of lettuce, Chinese cabbage, Mizuna mustard, red Russian kale, radish, chili peppers. A generation ship needs staple calories at scale, which means grain and starch crops, which means large illuminated growing volume and a substantial share of the ship's power budget going directly into photosynthesis. And it means the shipborne adult eats a narrow, repeating menu for 80 years. Not an inadequate one. A ship that gets nutrition wrong does not produce adults at all, so by definition the food works. But it is narrow, and it repeats, and novelty in food, which on Earth is effectively unlimited and free, is aboard a scarce resource that has to be deliberately managed by people whose job it is to think about morale. Every molecule of water in that adult's body, meanwhile, has passed through other people, through plants, and through machinery, many times over. This is already true aboard stations in orbit, where it is regarded as entirely unremarkable, and where the recovery rate runs around 90%, with demonstrated performance close to 98%. Aboard a generation ship, it is simply what water is, and nobody has ever thought about it twice. This is the largest single block of a shipborne existence, and the one with the least incident. 20 or 30 years in which nothing structural changes and the subject simply lives. Precisely because so little happens, It deserves the most careful treatment because it is where most of the life actually is. A day aboard is a constructed object. It begins because a lighting program brightens, not because anything rose. Human circadian biology does not reliably generate a 24-hour cycle on its own, and it needs an external signal to hold to one. Aboard a ship, that signal is entirely artificial, produced by equipment, on a schedule, maintained by people whose job includes it. The evidence for why that matters is unambiguous, and it comes from orbit, where the natural cycle of light and dark runs at 90 minutes instead of a day. Measured sleep falls to around 6.5 hours. Subjective quality drops. Wakefulness during the sleep period rises. Slow-wave sleep in the final third of the night is reduced. The amplitude of the body's own temperature rhythm flattens. The recommended fix is a rigorously imposed artificial cycle held to 24 hours, and a generation ship maintains that cycle in the same category as cabin pressure. There is a practical tail to the sleep findings that a ship cannot ignore. Sleep-promoting medication use among long-duration crews is high enough to be a standing operational concern, and a generation ship inherits that concern permanently. It has to be solved for centuries, without resupply, using only what can be manufactured aboard. Which means the lighting program is not merely a matter of preference. It is the cheapest available substitute for a pharmacy that can never be restocked, and it has to work for everyone. It will not work equally well for everyone, and that is worth saying. The human circadian period averages slightly longer than 24 hours and varies measurably between individuals. A fixed shipboard cycle will therefore suit some people better than others, permanently, with no possibility of adjustment beyond the personal. It is a small inequality, built quietly into the lighting, inherited by everyone born under it. The best available model for what decades of it feel like comes from long-duration ground isolation, and the picture it produces is consistent and slightly unnerving. A sealed 520-day simulation, run with a crew of 6, tracked activity and sleep continuously across the entire confinement. Physical activity declined steadily across the mission. Waking movement decreased. Sleep time increased. Waking rest time increased. This was a progressive settling into stillness, measured objectively rather than reported, and it happened to almost everyone. Light exposure decreased across the mission as well, without anybody deciding it should. People simply gravitated over months toward dimmer and more enclosed spaces. Most crew members experienced at least one of the following: disturbed sleep quality, degraded vigilance performance, or an altered sleep-wake rhythm. One person's cycle drifted off 24 hours entirely, settling near 25 hours and lengthening as the mission went on. And then, in the final 20 days, activity rose sharply again. As the end became imminent, the crew came back to life. That last detail is the crux, and it is where the shipborne life differs from every isolation study ever run. Every participant in every analog mission has had an end date. The rebound in the final weeks happened because there was a final week. The drift into stillness was not a physiological inevitability. It was motivational, and it reversed the moment there was something to move toward. The shipborne person does not have a final week. Not because their life is longer, but because the thing they are inside of does not end during it. The polar literature makes the same point from a different direction. Personnel who overwinter at isolated stations through 7 or 8 months of darkness show a recognizable cluster of effects. Low mood, irritability, disturbed sleep, reduced attention and memory, interpersonal friction with a small group they cannot get away from. There is even a characteristic vacant, unfocused gaze that observers describe as a mild hypnotic state, common enough to have its own informal name. And there is a robust timing effect that has been observed again and again. The worst period is the third quarter of the stay, and it arrives at the third quarter regardless of how long the stay actually is. It is not driven by accumulated hardship, because a longer stay does not move it. It is driven by the arithmetic of realizing that as much time remains as has already passed. For a shipborne person, that arithmetic never resolves. The denominator is not their life. As much of the voyage remains as they can imagine, always, at every age, in every year. There is no crossing of a halfway point, because the halfway point belongs to the ship rather than to the person standing in it. Against all of that, the ship has real defenses, and they should be named properly, because the picture is not one-sided. The work is genuinely necessary. This is the single largest difference between a generation ship and an isolation study. In an analog mission, tasks are assigned partly to fill time, and everyone involved knows it. Aboard a real vessel, every job is load-bearing. The reactor, the loops, the crops, and the structure all degrade without continuous attention, and everyone can see the consequence of neglect in the readings. Meaning is not manufactured aboard. It is structural, and it is available to anyone who wants it every single day. The population is large enough for a real social world. A few thousand people is enough for friendship, rivalry, love, art, argument, factions, gossip, and reputation. The entire ordinary machinery of human social life runs aboard exactly as it runs anywhere, because there are enough people for it to run on. The agricultural decks provide the closest available substitute for a natural environment, and the evidence that natural settings restore attention and buffer stress is genuinely strong. Growing things aboard is a psychological system as much as a nutritional one, and a ship that understood that would build its growing spaces to be walked through rather than merely harvested. And novelty can be manufactured deliberately. Festivals, seasons that the lighting program invents, ceremonies, competitions, rotations of assignment that move people between decks and between kinds of work. Every long isolated human community on Earth has invented some version of these independently, which is decent evidence that the manufacture of occasions is a real human requirement rather than a cultural accident. Long isolated groups reliably produce calendars with more festivals in them than their labor ever justified. There are costs to the small world too, and the sharpest one is that conflict has nowhere to go. Interpersonal friction in confined groups is one of the most reliably documented stressors there is, and aboard a ship it cannot be resolved by distance. There is no moving to another town. There is no losing touch. A disagreement is either resolved or it becomes a permanent feature of a life, navigated by careful avoidance inside a finite volume, for decades, by both parties. There is a further consequence of the small world that has no equivalent anywhere on Earth. There are no strangers. Every person the subject meets, they have already met. Every face in every corridor is a face with a history attached to it, a family, a role, a reputation. The ordinary human experience of anonymity, of moving unnoticed among people who owe you nothing and know nothing about you, does not exist aboard and never has. For some people that is a comfort. For others it is a pressure that does not let up, and there is no version of the ship in which it lets up. Boredom deserves naming directly, in the technical sense rather than the casual one. An unmet need for varied stimulation is a documented risk factor for cognitive decline and for risk-taking behavior, and both of those matter enormously in a population that has to stay sharp and cannot afford accidents. Which makes the entertainment archive a safety system rather than a luxury, and makes the people who curate it something closer to engineers than to librarians. The sensory texture of the day is the other thing worth conveying, because it is the part that never appears in any account of shipboard life and yet occupies all of it. It is constant. The temperature is constant. The humidity is held inside a narrow band. The light follows the same curve every day, brightening at the same rate, dimming at the same rate, for 80 years. The air smells the same. A closed atmosphere scrubbed through charcoal and catalytic beds, carrying the persistent off-gassing of plastics and electronics and people, plus whatever the growing decks contribute. And underneath all of it, between roughly 56 and 69 decibels, the machinery. The shipborne person does not hear it. It is not that they have learned to filter it out. It is that it was present before they had a nervous system capable of noticing anything, and it has never once stopped, and there has never been a moment of comparison. It is not noise to them. It is what silence sounds like. That is the ordinary shape of a ship-born middle age. Necessary work. Known faces. A repeating menu. A constructed day. A constant sound. And time that does not arrange itself into a story with an ending, because the story is longer than the person and always will be. It is not a hard life in the sense of hardship. Nothing aboard is trying to hurt anyone. It is a life in which nothing external ever changes, and in which everything that does change happens on the inside. At some point in adulthood, the subject of this account arrives on the other side of a conversation that was held about them before they existed. Someone once applied for permission to bring them into being. Now it is their turn to decide whether to apply. A closed population has 3 constraints on reproduction, and all 3 are in play at once. None of them are about anyone's preferences. The first is carrying capacity. The number of people the ship can support is set by the slowest recovering system aboard, and that is almost certainly food production and atmospheric balance rather than water or power. Recall what a sealed ecological facility on Earth managed to do to itself. Oxygen declining steadily for 16 months of a 2-year run, because a building material was quietly absorbing carbon dioxide and undoing the balance between what the plants made and what everything else consumed. That is the class of failure that sets a ship's ceiling. Not dramatic, not fast, not noticed until it has been running a long time. The second is genetic diversity. A sealed founding population carries a fixed pool of variation, and that pool can only narrow. Every pairing either preserves diversity or reduces it, and every reduction is permanent. There is no immigration to replenish it, and no mechanism to recover what is lost. The third is replacement timing. A population that reproduces too early develops a top-heavy age structure it cannot feed. One that reproduces too late risks losing skills before they have been transmitted to anyone. The ship needs births distributed evenly enough that every critical competence always has someone in training, which means birth timing is a workforce question as much as a demographic one, and births would cluster rather than distribute smoothly. There is a fourth pressure underneath those 3, and it operates on a longer timescale than any of them. A closed population accumulates founder effects. Traits that happen to be rare among the founding group become common purely by chance, and traits that were common vanish entirely within a few dozen generations without anything selecting for or against them. This is not disease. It is drift, and it is unavoidable in any small, isolated group. By the time the voyage ends, the population aboard is measurably not a random sample of the species that launched it. It is a particular and slightly arbitrary subset, shaped by which families happen to have more children in which century. None of that is visible from inside a single lifetime. The subject of this account would have no way to perceive it and no reason to think about it. It is simply the slow background process of being a small population running underneath every individual decision anyone aboard ever makes about anything. The result is that having a child aboard a generation ship is an administered event, not necessarily a coerced one. A well-run ship would almost certainly operate by allocation and consent rather than by command, because a population that resents its own reproduction arrangements is a population with a serious problem 2 generations later. But it is an event in which the ship is a party to the decision. The subject of this account grew up knowing that. They were themselves the product of it. And now they participate in it, without any sense that it is strange, because it never has been. The conversation itself would be domestic rather than dramatic. 2 people deciding whether to apply. It is the same conversation people have on Earth about whether they can afford a child, except that the currency is air, calories and shielded volume, and the answer comes back from a ledger rather than from a bank. The tone is ordinary. The stakes are enormous. Both of those things are true at once, and neither of them is felt as remarkable. Pairing itself carries the same weight. In a population of a few thousand, where everyone is known and where the genetic ledger is as public as everything else aboard is public, the choice of a partner is simultaneously the most private decision a person makes and a demographic input to a system that is watching. Human societies on Earth have organized marriage around kinship, property, and alliance for most of recorded history, so this is not unprecedented. What is unusual about the shipboard version is that its rationale is explicit, quantified, and written down. Genetic screening aboard is straightforward to justify and extremely difficult to bound. A ship that screens for lethal recessive conditions has already accepted the underlying principle, and the question of exactly where the line sits would be relitigated in every generation by people with different views and the same fixed pool. There is no correct answer available, only a decision that has to keep being made. There are hedges. Frozen genetic material carried from the founding population is cheap, compact, and substantially widens the effective gene pool without widening the physical one. A ship that packed it well would give its descendants options that its founders never had to use. But what is genuinely new aboard is not the screening or the arithmetic. It is the direction of the obligation. On Earth, a person has children for their own reasons. Love, continuity, accident, expectation, meaning. Aboard, every one of those reasons still applies, and one more is added on top, which is that the voyage requires it. A generation that declines to reproduce ends the mission as completely as a reactor failure would, and does it far more quietly, and nobody outside would ever know. That obligation runs in a strange direction. It is owed forward to people who do not yet exist, on behalf of a decision made backward by people who are long dead. The subject of this account is being asked to continue something they did not choose, for the benefit of someone who will not exist for 2 centuries, in order to honor an intention formed before their great-great-grandparents were born. There is no way to make that sound light, so the honest move is to make it ordinary, because it would be ordinary. Every human society transmits obligations across generations that the current generation did not choose. Debt, infrastructure, language, borders, climate. What the ship does is remove all the ambiguity and every alternative and then write the obligation down in a document that everyone can read. There is one absence underneath all of this that is sharper than any of the constraints, and it is worth naming before moving on. There is no emigration valve. On Earth, a person who does not want the arrangement they were born into has, at least in principle, somewhere to take that objection. They can leave. They can go somewhere the rules are different. Aboard, there is nowhere to take it. The objection is heard, or it is not, and either way the person remains inside the thing they are objecting to for the rest of their life, working alongside everyone they disagreed with. Older people aboard have unusual value in this arrangement, which is a genuine and underappreciated advantage. In a population with no external childcare and no external anything, a generation still capable of light work is a demographic asset rather than a cost. Grandparents aboard are useful and known to be useful, and that changes how a person ages in a way that most modern societies on Earth have quietly lost. It is worth being clear about what the alternative would look like, because a ship that got this wrong would not fail loudly. A population that declined slowly, generation by generation, because too few people applied or too few applications were approved, would pass through decades in which everything still worked and everyone was still comfortable. The corridors would simply be quieter. Roles would consolidate. Someone would eventually notice that a competence had only one holder left. The failure would be visible in a spreadsheet long before it was visible in a corridor, and by the time it was visible in a corridor, it would already be settled. Which is why the ledger exists in the first place, and why it is not resented aboard. It is not a rule imposed on people. It is the mechanism by which a few thousand people keep themselves from quietly disappearing, and everyone can see the arithmetic, and the arithmetic is not in dispute. And then, if the answer is yes, the cycle closes. The subject's child is conceived in the same shielded core, gestated under the same unmeasured partial gravity that no human developed under before this voyage began. Born into the same environment where the dose rate outside the shielding runs at about 1 4/5 millisieverts per day. Calibrated by the same rotation. Raised under the same lighting program. Taught from the same archive by the same method. Told, at the same age, the same thing about where they are and what is outside the hull. The one difference is that the subject can tell them it is fine and mean it because it was. The subject of this account is old now, and this is where a number stated much earlier finally means something. Recall it exactly as it was given. In deep space, outside any planetary magnetic field, the measured radiation dose rate is about 1 4/5 millisieverts per day. When that figure first appeared, it was an engineering input. It was the reason the gestation core is the most heavily shielded volume aboard, and the reason a pregnancy happens in one part of the vessel rather than another. It was a design constraint applied by people to a room. It is the same number now. It has not changed, and it will not change for the remainder of the voyage. What has changed is the limit of the integration. At that rate, an unshielded year comes to something on the order of 2/3 of a sievert. A crude round trip to Mars is expected to accumulate close to a full sievert, and that is regarded as a substantial career dose for a professional astronaut who has trained for it, volunteered for it, and will come home afterward. A shipborne person does not have a career dose. They have a life dose, and the life is 80 years long. Unshielded, that integrates to a figure many times over anything a human body can survive. Which means the shielding is not a wall that stops something. It is a budget, drawn down every single day, including all the days when nothing at all happens. and shielding has limits that get worse the more of it you add. Modeling of thick shields finds that roughly 180 grams per square centimeter of regolith still leaves about 200 millisieverts per year, which is only around a quarter below the unshielded figure. The reason is that high-energy particles do not simply stop when they hit the shield. They fragment inside it, and the fragments include neutrons, and the neutrons carry on. Past a certain thickness, adding mass starts producing nearly as much secondary radiation as it absorbs. It is worth being precise about what that dose actually does, because the popular picture is wrong. Galactic cosmic radiation is not a beam, and it is not a burst. It is a continuous sleet of atomic nuclei moving at close to the speed of light, arriving from every direction at once, at a rate low enough that no individual event registers as anything. A person standing in it feels nothing, sees nothing, and hears nothing. The particles pass through the hull, through the shielding, through the furniture, and through the person, a few of them every second, for a lifetime. Damage is done at the scale of individual molecules and is repaired almost all of the time. The risk is entirely statistical, and it is entirely cumulative, which is why it can be planted as an engineering constraint in one part of a life and cached as a biography in another. Nothing about the physics changed. Only the amount of time it was allowed to run. So a generation ship cannot solve the problem. It can only manage it, continuously, everywhere its people live, for centuries. The most effective material per unit mass is hydrogen-rich, which is convenient because that describes water, stored waste, food, and crops. The ship's most protective structures are the things it needed to carry anyway. Solar particle events are a separate hazard with a completely different shape, and it is worth distinguishing them. Those are sharp, brief, and enormously reduced by even a few grams per square centimeter of material. A small, heavily shielded shelter handles them well. The steady galactic background is the opposite, mild, permanent, and barely touched by anything achievable. One of those two hazards can be hidden from. The other cannot. This is the quiet fact underneath a ship-borne old age. This person has not been exposed to an event. Nothing happened to them. They have been standing inside a slow, invisible, entirely unremarkable accumulation since before they were born, and the total was the only thing that was ever going to matter. There is no moment in that life where anything is felt. There is only a number that was always going up. Beyond dose, aging aboard has its own shape, and most of it follows from things already established. The body has been underloaded for its entire existence, and the tissues that respond to load also respond to age. On Earth, bone loss with age is a well-understood decline from a peak. Aboard, the peak was lower to begin with, and where the decline leads depends entirely on where that unknown threshold sits. Muscle follows the same argument. A ship-born person at 80 is plausibly frailer than an Earth-born one of the same age, or plausibly not, and nobody aboard will ever be in a position to say which because there is no one to compare against. The immune system, already running with reduced T-cell and natural killer cell function under chronic low-grade stress, now ages on top of that. Reactivation of latent viruses, which already occurs in roughly half of long-duration crews on missions vastly shorter than a lifetime, becomes an ordinary background feature of getting old aboard. Not a crisis. A recurring nuisance that everyone expects and everyone's parents had. Accumulated dose shows up here too, in a form people rarely associate with radiation. Cumulative exposure is linked to cardiovascular risk, as well as to cancer, which means the ledger from the previous section appears in shipboard old age partly as heart disease rather than only as tumors. The number does not announce itself. It simply makes the ordinary illnesses of age slightly more likely, slightly earlier, in everyone. And the medical ceiling is fixed. Whatever the ship can do, it has always been able to do, and it will never be able to do more. There is no advance arriving from outside. The most sophisticated treatment available at the end of this person's life is the same treatment that was available at the start, minus whatever consumables have run out, plus whatever the ship's own people have worked out for themselves in the meantime. There is also a specific feature of a ship-borne old age that has no equivalent anywhere, which is generational position. The subject is old. They remember people who are now dead. Those people, in turn, remembered other people who were dead before them. Somewhere far back along that chain, there was someone who had met someone who had actually stood on a planet. By now, the chain has more links than anyone can hold in mind, and the connection is documentary rather than personal. The oldest generation aboard at any moment is the last living link to anything beyond documentation. Institutional memory lives in human heads for at most a century. Everything older than that is a record, and records are read rather than remembered. Which gives age a functional authority aboard that most societies on Earth have quietly given up. Population structure adds one more feature to a ship-borne old age that is easy to miss. Because births aboard are timed against workforce needs rather than distributed randomly, the people who are old at any given moment are old together. They are a cohort. They entered training in the same years, held the same roles, and are now handing them over at the same time. The experience of aging aboard is therefore shared far more tightly than it is on Earth, where a person's contemporaries are scattered across a whole society. Aboard, everyone the subject's age is going through exactly the same transition, in the same corridors, in the same decade. That is a form of company that most people on a planet never have. And the subject will die in the middle of the voyage. Not near the beginning, not near the end. In the middle, like almost everyone who has ever been aboard, and like almost everyone who ever will be. Then there is the body itself, and the closed loop it belongs to. On a sealed vessel, nothing organic leaves. The water loop already recovers around 90% of the ship's water from urine, sweat, and cabin humidity, with demonstrated performance close to 98. The carbon loop already takes the crew's exhaled carbon dioxide, runs it through a reactor with hydrogen, and returns water. A human body is mass, water, carbon, and minerals that the ship counted at departure and cannot replace. Whatever the ceremony aboard looks like, and there will be one, because human beings have never once failed to invent one, the material goes back into the loops. Stated plainly, without any attempt to make it either grim or beautiful, everyone aboard is made partly of everyone who came before them. They all know it. It has been true for centuries. And it is completely ordinary. The atmosphere itself has changed too, in a way nobody would notice from inside a single life. The air at the end of this person's life is measurably not the air the ship departed with. Trace gases accumulate slowly. The scrubbers chase a drifting target for centuries, and they never quite catch it, and the difference across 80 years is far too small to smell. The life is over, and it can be set out in order, calmly, one piece at a time. Conceived by permission in the most heavily shielded volume aboard. Gestated under a gravity level no human being has ever been measured under, because the only two levels ever measured are 1 and approximately none. Born into a room whose sound never stops. Calibrated in the first year by rotation rather than by a world, so that the sensation of a head turning while a body moves is not strangeness, but simply what turning is. taught to walk on a floor that curves upward in both directions and never crests. Taught to throw at a target 2 meters to one side of where the object was meant to land. Taught, without anyone teaching it, that walking one way down a corridor is heavier than walking the other. Grown up under interior light, with eyes that almost certainly needed correcting, in a life where the muscles that pull focus out to infinity were exercised a few thousand times in total, on purpose, at a viewport. Educated in 2 curricula at once. One to keep the ship alive, and one to keep a species recognizable to itself. Told in middle childhood that the world is finite, that it can be walked through entirely, and that both ends of the voyage exist only as records in a machine. Worked at something genuinely necessary for 30 years, in a place where nobody has ever had to invent a reason to be useful. Loved people, in a population small enough to be known completely, and too small to ever be anonymous in. Applied, perhaps, for permission, and either received it or did not. Aged under an accumulating dose that was never once felt. Died in the middle of the crossing, like almost everyone. Before the ending, the counterweight, given in full and in good faith, because this account has spent a long time on constraint. None of the above is experienced as deprivation. Deprivation requires a comparison, and the comparison is not available. A ship-born person does not miss weather any more than any of us misses a sense we were never born with. The work is real and necessary, which is more than most human beings in history have been able to say about their working lives. Nothing aboard is busy work, and everyone can see what happens when a thing is neglected. The social world is small but complete. Everyone is known. There is no invisibility, no falling through the cracks, and no dying unnoticed in a corridor, because nobody was expecting you anywhere. The environment is stable in a way no environment on Earth has ever been. There is no weather to survive, no famine, no war between nations, no predator, no new disease arriving from somewhere else, because there is no somewhere else for it to arrive from. And the purpose is unambiguous and shared. Every person aboard is part of a single project whose value nobody disputes. Most human societies have never managed that for more than a few years at a time, and this one holds it for centuries, without effort, because the alternative is visible through the hull. So it is not a lesser life. It is a different one, and it is worth ending on the specific way in which it is different. Return to the window. It was set down near the start of this account as a plain engineering fact, and left alone. The ship has a viewport. Through it, the stars do not appear to move. Across an entire human lifetime, the view changes by an amount too small to see without instruments. It is worth being exact about that, because the view is not literally frozen. The ship's instruments record change constantly. Over the full crossing, the nearest stars shift measurably against the more distant ones, and after a single light-year of travel, that shift is substantial enough to map. The destination star brightens across the voyage, slowly and steadily, and it is the one genuinely changing feature of the sky. At an appreciable fraction of light speed, there is even a faint color difference between the forward view and the aft one. The light ahead shifted slightly toward blue, and the light behind shifted slightly toward red, detectable by instrument and invisible to a person. But none of that is available to an eye. Across the 80 years of a single life, the total change in the visible sky is smaller than the difference between 2 glances. A person could stand at that viewport at 8 years old and again at 80 and see, for all practical purposes, the same thing. Every instrument aboard would disagree, and every instrument aboard would be right, and it would make no difference whatsoever to what the person saw. There is one more thing the instruments would record that the person could not. At a fifth of the speed of light, time aboard runs about 2% slow relative to home. Across a full life, that amounts to something like a year and a half. The subject of this account lived a slightly shorter life than they would have on Earth, measured from Earth, and lived every second of it at the ordinary speed, and no one aboard would ever have reason to mention it. That was stated as a limitation. It is the opposite. Every human being who has ever lived on Earth has stood inside a world that changed around them while they stayed more or less the same. Seasons turned. Cities were built and fell down. Rivers moved. Coastlines shifted. Whole generations passed through and were replaced, and the person stood in the middle of all that motion and watched it happen. The world was the variable. The self was the fixed point from which the variation was measured. The shipborne life inverts that completely. The view out the window does not change. The temperature does not change. The sound does not change. The lighting curve does not change. The corridor at the end of the deck is the same corridor at 80 that it was at 8, down to the sound the floor plate makes. Which means that in this one life, uniquely among all human lives, the environment is the constant. And the only thing in the entire visible universe that measurably changes across those 80 years is the person themselves. Their body, growing and then declining. Their understanding, widening and then settling. The people they knew, arriving and leaving. The dose beneath them, climbing. That is what it would be like to be born on a generation ship. Not a life spent going somewhere. A life spent being the only moving thing. There is one small consolation available to that person, which they would probably never think to take. Every generation aboard is the middle generation, from its own point of view. The experience described here is not a special case, or a hard luck posting, or the unlucky part of the voyage. It is the standard human experience of that ship. Only 2 generations ever encounter the crossing as an event, the one that departs and the one that arrives. Every generation in between encounters it as a place and calls it home and is right to. And if the voyage does eventually end, the descendants of the person in this account will be the first human beings in many centuries to stand on a surface under an open sky with a horizon in front of them and nothing overhead. They will find it as strange as their ancestors found the ship familiar. They will have to learn to throw in a straight line. They will look up, and there will be no ceiling, and no one will have prepared them for what that feels like, because no one aboard could have. But that is a long way from here, and it is not this person's life, and it was never going to be. The ship goes on, steady, quiet, moving at a speed nobody aboard can feel, through a distance nobody aboard will finish. The lighting has dimmed for the night, as it has dimmed every night for centuries. The machinery is running as it always runs, at a level no one aboard has ever once described as noise. And so the life ends where it began, in a room that never changed, aboard a ship still moving exactly as steadily as it was on the day that person was born. Nothing out there ever asked anything of them, and nothing out there ever will. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight go out of your shoulders. Sleep well, and good night.